The normal announcement: turn off your cell phones, turn off the ringers. Well, welcome. We have a good capacity crowd upstairs. I think there's a little more room downstairs, so we're not having to turn people away. Thankful for that. We did the first week. The last 2 weeks we didn't, so we always work on how to do these programs, and we keep notes for ourselves, and we'll be trying to figure out what to do with an overcapacity crowd. Good to have you all here today. We support the courthouse in a couple different ways. These programs are the one time of the year that we have large crowds in here. So we pass the sock around, and we have several donation jars. I'll start the sock. And we appreciate generosity. That helps keep the courthouse open. The other thing we do is we have memberships and little blue tickets. They're on those same tables where the donation jars are. And if you're not a member already, we invite you to become a member. That gets us the information that we can let you know when things are happening here at the courthouse. And we have these February programs. We often have a program at the beginning of the summer tourist season and some other special events during the year. Let's see, what else do we have to?
Isn't Lauren enough?
Yeah. So the drawing today, we'll do the drawing at the end of the program, but we have a couple things to give away. I brought some original courthouse pencils up here. That's a little one. We'll build up. We'll also do a membership. We will have a drawing for a membership, and if a member already draws it, then we'll let somebody else draw it who's not a member. And a bottle of wine. Well, we had... So that I guess has become a tradition, we have to say. Since Lonnie did his program and brought a bottle of wine, we did it last week again, and here another bottle shows up. So those will be a drawing at the end of the program. We are privileged, really, in our town to have people like Eric and Jackie, who are professional archaeologists, who are really very much involved in our community, preserving that old building in the former Chinatown, and educating people about that. Doing programs occasionally at the courthouse. We call it regional history, and I think the last one that you did was Southern Oregon, wasn't it? Yeah, some explorations down there. So we can go wide on the region, or we can stay right at home, which is exactly what Eric is going to do for us today. He is a member of the board at Fort Dalles. He's president of the board here. Aren't you president of something else? Another board? Yeah. Historic Landmarks Commission, yes. So definitely a contributing member of our community here. And Eric is going to tell us all about the little known parts of the Fort Dalles. We all know the surgeon's quarters. Most of us know that there was kind of a semicircle up there around the parade ground, but there are all kinds of other parts of Fort Dalles scattered around our town, up on the near area to the present fort, but also some other places that may be surprising. So Eric, we are all yours. Take it away.
Okay, is the microphone working? Can everybody hear me?
Put it up next to your mouth.
How's that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank the courthouse for inviting me to come and give this program. It's a topic that I've been thinking about for years and years and years, and then, about 6 months ago, I finally sat down and started working on it. And so this is kind of the accumulation of that work, but it's also kind of the beginning of this project, because there's always once you start looking at these kind of things, you start going down different alleys and finding other things, and then other things turn up. So this is kind of, should be seen probably as kind of preliminary at this point. So I'm going to start out with this slide, and there's an image on this slide that was painted by a professional artist, James Madison Holden, who was coming through the Dalles in 1857. And he got up above the fort and did this watercolor picture of it. And it turned out that watercolor eventually, through the years, made it to the Benacke Library at Yale University. And then some volunteers up at Fort Dalles were looking through a book and saw part of this watercolor reproduced in the book and said, well, we should get this for our collection. So we sent off to the university, and they were gracious enough to scan the image and give us a copy of it and let us use it for our own use up at Fort Dalles. So there's a larger version of this up there if anybody ever wants to go up to Fort Dalles and take a look at it. It's really quite a pretty picture, and it really shows the fort. It's a little hard to see in this scale, but kind of back in the trees here is where the surgeon's quarters is. This was the double captain's or officer's quarters there, and the commanding officer's house was here, Colonel Wright's house. And then you can see the little, this is 1857 is when the Dalles became incorporated, and kind of there it is as a light scatter of buildings down by the river. So this is a timeline of Fort Dalles. It's by no means a complete timeline, but it kind of gives you an idea about the development of the fort in the area. And so the fort and the town are built on the lands that the Wasco and Wishram people occupied from time memorial. And the first settlement colonization of the area really started in 1836 with the Methodist mission coming and putting their mission up near the springs where the high school is now, back behind the high school. And then that was followed by a Catholic mission in 1848, which was on the other side of Mill Creek, kind of where the current Catholic Church was within that Catholic mission area. And then with the killings at the Whitman Mission and the start of the Cayuse War in 1847 is when Fort Dalles really started to become a military post, starting as Camp Drum, which the volunteers and soldiers occupied the Methodist mission grounds that by then had been rather abandoned. And then Fort Dalles was officially established in 1853. And then during the Yakima War is when it was mostly developed and used. And with a series of improvements that really took place when Colonel Wright and Captain Jordan were there up at the fort from 1855 to 1858, or 59, is when the improvements were made. And then, by 1864, so only about 5 years later, the War Department was starting to recommend that the military reservation was now superfluous, should be abandoned and sold. And so the real last use of the fort was in 1867, although I did notice that there was, in looking at some of the muster papers from the Modoc War, some of the Warm Spring Scouts that served at the Modoc War ended their term of service here at Fort Dalles, and that would have been in 1873, so there was obviously still some stuff going on here even into the 1870s. 1876, there was a proposal by the state of Oregon that the military reservation be turned into an insane asylum. So that was brought before Congress, and then the Congressional Committee looked at that recommendation and then thought, well, if we turn that military reservation over to the state, then that'll set a precedent and we'll have to do it all over the place. So instead, they recommended what the military department had recommended, that it be declared surplus and then sold. So that's what they recommended in 1877. So it took a little while for those wheels to turn. In 1878, 79, the General Land Office, who was going to get the reservation from the military, was part of the Department of the Interior. And so they started doing some more intense mapping and trying to figure out, well, what exactly is the military reservation and how do we delineate it, because you have to figure out what you have before you can sell it. So that's when that all started. And then 1881, they actually hired a surveyor to come out and survey it. And by that time, they decided they were going to plat it out as an addition to the city of the Dalles and sell lots. So that took, about a year to get that surveying done. And then by 1882, they were ready to sell lots. And so those lots were then sold by the land office here in the Dalles. And interestingly enough, 12 years, a few years later, 1904 was when the lots where the Fort Dalles Surgeons' Quarters was actually turned over to the Oregon Historical Society. So for 22 years or something, they didn't sell those lots. So there was the doctor that occupied the surgeon's quarters was also a bit of an artist. And just a couple years ago, Lynn Wilcox, I think, was looking through, trying to do a little history of him, and found out that some of his diary entries and some of the art that he did was also at the library at Yale University. So wrote back there and managed to get his diaries copied and also some of his art. So this is a painting that he did showing kind of the main parade ground and buildings surrounding the parade ground at Fort Dalles, which is really a pretty fascinating photograph to look at. You can really see that the fort was built on a slope, that it wasn't just a nice flat place, and the parade ground sloped and everything was uphill and downhill from everything else. But of course, the colonel's quarters was at the very rise right there, and all of that area. About the only building left here now is the surgeon's quarters, which is kind of obscured by trees once again in this photograph. But some of this really gives us an idea of that layout and some of the other buildings. There are two buildings that were called old at this time, even though this is 1858, 1859, and these were built in 1850, so they weren't all that old. But there was the old log officers' quarters there, and then the downhill company quarters, this one here was part of those 1850s developments as well. They added a porch to it during the 1856, 1859 kind of developments and did some improvements to it, but it's one of the older buildings as well.
Eric, quick question.
Yeah.
Go back. Directional, which is north, south, where would Trevitt Street be?
Well, so the Columbia River is down here.
Okay.
Trevitt Street's back over here somewhere. So Garrison is the one that goes right down this way.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And so Colonel Wright's school, this building, the old officers' quarters, is right in the back playground of Colonel Wright's school. So then there's this, whoops.
Picture with the tree coming out of the roads is always a good.
Yeah, so that's the old log officer's house. So they built that, at least the porch, right around a tree. And that's one of Dr. Brown's illustrations as well. And then up on the left is from the plans that Louis Scholl drew for the officers' quarters, and that's the surgeon's quarters.
And those are now all at the Oregon Historical Society. So then we're also fortunate that we have some period pictures of some of the officers' dwellings. I think these were taken by Lieutenant Lorenzo Lorraine, who was coming through. He had been stationed up at Fort Walla Walla and then had been sent down to Fort Umpqua and came through the Dalles in 1857. And I think these are his photos, although I've never seen any firm attribution. So you can see that two of the buildings are still under construction. So the surgeon's quarters is getting its chimney put on here. And they're in the middle of building the double captain's or officer's quarters, which was located just to the southwest of the surgeon's quarters. So here's some period photographs of the surgeon's quarters. The two on the left are from before it became a museum, and then the two on the right are from its early days as a museum. I think the colorized photograph at the top is from probably the aughts or the teens when it had just been made a museum building, and then the lower one is, I think, from the 1950s, perhaps, although the car is a little older, when it had been refreshed a little bit. So we're also fortunate to have some later photos of the fort in disrepair. So this is after it's been abandoned, and these photographs mostly on this sheet are of the guardhouse. So you can see the guardhouse there. It turns out that when they plat out all the streets, the guardhouse is right in the middle of an intersection. So it doesn't end up surviving the development. You can see it's built up on a stone foundation and the ground is really slopey. And there's a few pictures that show a flume in the background as well. So the flume bringing lumber down to town. So here's a few other pictures. So the stables, which were down off of 10th Street, are there on the left. And then there's another photograph that shows where the guardhouse is, but it also shows the company quarters. Both of those buildings, the one on the left and the one kind of in the middle of the photo that's in ruins at this point, were the company quarters, so where the regular troops were quartered. The one at the left was one that was built based on Louis Scholl's plans, so from sometime in 1856, 1857. And then the one on the right that's in ruins is the older one that had been kind of fixed up at that time as well. And then there's the bakery, which went on baking bread even after the fort was abandoned. So there's a couple of pictures here. And you'll notice that this one on the left has a sign up on the tree that says Bridge Street. So this picture dates after the military reservation had been changed to the military addition to the fort, or to the city. So streets had already been laid out and platted. So. And then I just want to mention that there's more than just the surgeon's quarters remain from the fort. One of the other buildings that remains is the gardener's cottage. So there's a 1929 picture of it when it was over at 13th and Liberty. And then it got moved to the fort, I think sometime in the 1930s or 40s. I had a source that kind of gave me a good date on that, and I seem to have lost that source, so I got to find that again to figure out that exact date. But you can see that it's on that lower left, it's now been moved to the fort, and they're working on kind of fixing it up, putting a new roof on and stuff. They removed this portion of the building when they moved it. So that's why there's a door here, and these two wooden strips are where the edge of that wing of the building would have been. And that was the original part of the building that got removed when it moved. So there's a bunch of newspaper articles all about kind of the way that the fort is getting divided up. So, you know, the first article talks about possibly going to become an insane asylum. There's other articles that then talk about the Congress making an act to turn it over to the general land office for sale. And these are all from online sources. There really doesn't seem to be much in the local papers, but I think there's kind of a gap in the online local papers from this time period, so perhaps that's not too surprising. So then there's a little bit in the Oregonian as well, from 1904 and 1905 when Congress turned over the lots and the surgeons' quarters to the Oregon Historical Society. So a nice big write-up in the Sunday Oregonian right as the museum is about to open, and then one in 1904 from when it got turned over to the Historical Society. So, of course, changing a fort and getting rid of it and turning it over from the Army War Department to the Department of the Interior required a congressional act. So this is a copy of the congressional act on the last side, on the left side, and then on the right side is how it got kind of sent out to the local areas. So that's in 1877, so that's when it gets turned over to the general land office. But there's a lot of complications involved in that the boundaries of the military reservation changed a lot from 1852 when this map was made. This is a map that's in the back of this book that the Oregon Historical Society put out, Picturesque Frontier. So this is one of the earliest maps that shows the military reservation, and it's from 1852. And at that time, the military reservation was a 10-mile square, so really big. And at some point they decided, well, that kind of...
Originally, all forts had to be 10 square miles.
Yeah, and so it turned out that kind of inhibited local development, and people complained that they couldn't do anything in the surrounding area and stuff. So the fort got shrunk down progressively as the years went by. Eventually becoming a mile square and then getting whittled down as they deeded off portions of it to the city for development of the city, and then prior land claims figured in as well, because the fort wasn't the first one here, right? There was the Methodist mission here and the Catholic mission, and then the city forming up. So the military didn't have like prime occupation of the area, so they had to kind of reduce their area as time went by. So this is a map from 1856, 1859, and we have copies of it on the table over there if anybody wants to take a look at it. This is in the Oregon Historical Society's collection, and I think these came from Louis Scholl's papers, which he donated to the Oregon Historical Society when they formed Fort Dalles Museum. So really good documents, because he's sketching out, this is the plan for the fort that he was helping to rebuild in 1856 to 1859. So you can see kind of the main layout and then some of the buildings that are off to the side. So the hospital is here, and that's pretty close to town. That's on the bluffs just above town, above Mill Creek. The sawmill, which is on Mill Creek, and that turns out to be about where the 9th Street Bridge crosses Mill Creek. And then the stables, which are down off the 10th Street. And then there's the old company barracks here. And I don't know whether that one was then moved over to here and remodeled, or if that one was torn down and this was a secondary one. It's not exactly clear, but he has a guardhouse over here, which he said was moved uphill. So this is probably the guardhouse that was there, got moved to here, and then got kind of remodeled in that location to kind of meet the style of the rest of the fort. So here's the surgeon's quarters here. There's that old log officer's building that had the tree growing out through the porch. There's the captain's quarters, which you can still see the foundation stones at Fort Dalles Museum. There's the commanding officer's house here, which is gone. Captain Jordan's house here. And then down over by the creek, there's the wheelwright shop, the carpenter shop, and the blacksmith shop, all down right by the creek. And then across the creek, there were laundress quarters. And that's over in the area where the Oddfellows Cemetery is. So this is a map that kind of shows a more generalized sketch map that shows the surrounding area as well as where the officers' buildings and the parade ground are. And the river is down here on this map. And town is right, the Dalles City is right here. And you can see the company gardens, which is out by where the high school is. This map is not really all that much to scale, but it turned out to be really useful for the surveyors that came in the 1880s to try and find the corners of the reservation, because the corners are all marked with letters here. And then there's a description of what bearings were taken in between them and the distances. So this really helped them kind of establish where the edges of the military reservation were when they started surveying it out for distribution. So Louis Scholl drew all of those great maps and the sketches and planned the buildings with Captain Jordan for all the improvements. And then he left and ended up during the Civil War over on the East Coast in Washington. By the 1860s, he was back in Oregon, and he was renting ground from the military. So the military was renting out ground in 1867 at the fort, ground they weren't using anymore. So there's a series of letters back and forth between Louis Scholl and the quartermaster's office at Fort Vancouver, which was kind of administering the reservation. So he actually rented some land and had a little bit of pasture there on the military reservation. His house is right here, I think, and he laid a water line from the spring to his house so he could have running water, and so he could irrigate his garden. And then Orlando Humison's house, which still stands, is right here. So that's kind of a little key here. And then Robert Petlin's reservoir, which is no longer in existence, but is right over here, kind of in one of those rocky areas. So right above the Court Street School is right down in this area, where the state office buildings are now. So 1870s is when after 1877, the General Land Office is going to get this property to divide, so they start trying to figure out what exactly it is they have and how they're going to map it and how they're going to divide it. So this is one of the early maps that they draw to kind of try and figure this out. So this map has all the various land claims and also the military reservation on it. This map is for a township range section. So it's 6 miles by 6 miles square. Here it is again, with a little more detail. And if we zoom in, you can see that there's a lot going on here. This is in the area of the Dalles, so we have William Laughlin's donation land claim to the east side of town. We have Bigelow's down here, I think, the Methodist mission claims, which are all these kind of odd triangles all around the fort, and then the Catholic mission claim here. And Victor Trevitt has a claim in a way down south of town here. So this is where they draw out some of those boundaries and what they date to and stuff. So that there's a little color coding here. It's a little hard to see at this scale, but there's one military reservation, which was an earlier one, and then there's, when it got refined down, it's this size, and then you have the City of the Dalles claims and the Methodist Mission claims. And so it gets really complicated, and they have to figure out who really owns what. And it wasn't really until the 1880s, I think, that they really settled all the Methodist Mission claims. Got title to everything. So then here's another one here. So this one's trying to point out where all the Methodist mission claims are. So you have the Dalles City claim here, which is interrupted by a little bit of the mission claim here, then a mission claim up here. But they did sketch in some of the fort buildings on this claim as well. So then we can also look online. They have the field notes from the 1881 survey. So these are all the notes they took while they were doing the survey to lay out the blocks and the streets and the lots in the military reservation. So this survey was done by Thomas Lang, I think. Well, if I'm not mistaken, was the father of the Lang sisters, who were the clerks down at the land office as well. So it gets a little interesting when you think about all of that. So here he is just talking about how they're initially defining the area that he's going to have to come and survey. And so you start reading in these maps. These notes first start out with him talking about all the problems and the complications, right? So he's there. He says, well, maybe I should walk over everything first. So he goes out and walks over everything, and he makes sure that all the people that he's walking with him aren't on government employment, but they're just there to kind of help him try and find things. So he's looking for all of these corners which had been marked by monuments, like stacks of rocks, or by bearing trees. And he finds that there's only one of those left. So he's got to try and kind of reestablish where all of these places go. And it turns out that this had been surveyed before, maybe a year or two before, but in the meantime, he calls them the settlers on the military reservation had moved all of those monuments around, mostly to their advantage, it seems. So he's there trying to get things figured out, and he's working with the city because the city is going to help sell these lots, I believe. And so city councilors come out with some old maps and show him the old maps, and he's walking around with the maps trying to figure everything out. And it takes him a while. He's got to kind of reestablish things, and then he's got to figure out which surveys to trust and which ones not to trust. And then how to kind of rectify everything so that, well, maybe not everybody's happy, but at least he can justify how he sets things up. So he goes to set up the survey, and they get there's all sorts of regulations as to how he's going to do it. He's got to lay it all out, lay the streets out, and then the blocks out, and then each four corner of the blocks has to be marked with a stone monument, which is made in just such a way. And then each of the lots divisions he puts in a cedar wooden stake, which is marked with which lot number and which block it is. And so it gets kind of rather complicated, and he, of course, has to do it 2 or 3 times, it seems, as well. Just because, well, sometimes things get moved, and then sometimes he's a little off on his bearings and then has to come back and figure out where things went wrong and start all over again. So it's kind of a slow process, and eventually the Bureau of Surveys gets a little bit frustrated by how long it's taking him. So they say, well, how about if we throw a few more surveyors at this? So they throw a few more surveyors at it. And of course that causes complications, because then he's got to explain to them what's going on and where to start and everything. And they start and they find errors as well. So eventually they get it all worked out. And then once it's all worked out, then they have to sell the lots. So there's regulations as to how the lots are sold. So nobody gets first claim, even if they're happen to be settled on the land. They don't get a first claim, so it's kind of first come, first serve, and highest bidder. And so that makes things a little more complicated, no doubt. Yeah. And so when they finally get things issued, they give people these nice pieces of paper for the land that they just bought, which this particular one got donated to Fort Dalles not very long ago, and it's signed by Chester Arthur, the president of the country.
President of what?
The president of the country at that time. So a pretty cool document to have. So this is the map that they end up producing of the military reservation. So it takes them about a year, a lot of surveying, a lot of laying out of blocks and lots. So you can see there's a lot of divisions in there. And I had remembered seeing this map years and years ago, and I had thought, oh, what a cool map, because it not only has just the outlines and the blocks and everything, it has the buildings that were existing at the time of the survey, which are a lot of the fort buildings. And I thought, well, this would really be key to try and figure out how the fort was all laid out. And then we can use this map to kind of try and fix the older maps and get everything all figured out. So, of course, when it came time to look for that map, I couldn't find it anywhere. I thought that I made a copy of it and couldn't find that. And then I thought, well, maybe the city has a copy. So I went down to the city and they looked all over and couldn't find a copy of it. And then I went out to the Discovery Center because Susan said that Ken Korsminski had donated some maps. And I know that Ken had been interested in this as well. So I thought, oh, well, maybe that's where they're at. So I went out there and we spent a day digging through the maps that Ken had donated. And none of them were this map. And I was beginning to think I was a little bit crazy. So then I thought, well, maybe it was at Fort Dalles, which is, of course, where I should have started looking. And I went there, and Mary Davis was there, and she typed in Fort Dalles military reservation map in the search thing and said, oh, yeah, it's here, and it's upstairs in this room. We went up there, and she pulled it right out, and I said, ah, that's the one I've been looking for all these months. So I took a picture of it, and then came back and eventually put it into my program, but then it doesn't have a date on it or anything, so, or any kind of legend other than, this title for it, which is a little unusual. And so, I thought, well, it's somewhere in the 1880s probably, but it doesn't really say much about it. So then I went down to the planning office because I had some other work to do there, and I was talking to the planner, and her screensaver came up, and her screensaver was this map. And so I said, I've been looking for that map forever. Where did you get that? And she said, well, the county has it. And so here it is, and it's got the legend on it that says who drew it and the dates and all of that kind of stuff. And the only problem with it is it's a little bit cut off down at the bottom. But that's okay. It's a pretty darn good copy. It was better than the copy that I had made with my camera, so that was pretty good. And so then I went to start putting all these maps into my mapping program. And then I did a little bit of internet searching, and I thought, oh, maybe I should look and see what they have at the National Archives. And lo and behold, they had another copy at the National Archives, and this one was in color. And so it shows the mill pond as being blue and stuff. But unfortunately, they only have half of this map, at least half of it online. So I've got to try and see if I can get the other half. But interestingly about this one is that all of the fort buildings have little numbers in them. And as part of this mapping and documentation of the fort, they had to do appraisals of all of the buildings as well. Kind of say what condition they were in and assess them and how much worth they had. And that might be related to all of that documents, but I haven't found those yet. But it's going to be kind of fascinating to try and track those down.
Yeah.
So that brings me to this task of trying to put all of these maps onto the modern maps. So this is a modern map showing the Dalles area. The Columbia River and the Dalles is right down here. And when you zoom in on these maps, you can see that there's still a legacy of all of these other surveys and of the mission claims and the Catholic mission claims and the old City of the Dalles claims. You can see just how kind of confusing it gets in here. If you usually look at maps of this age, and it's all just rectangles, right? But there's lines going all over the place. These lines all go to the original survey monument that a lot of these things were tied into, which was a stone. I believe it was a stone kind of near the mouth of Mill Creek, which of course isn't there anymore. So there's still some legacy from all of those, from the 1850s all the way up to the 1880s that's visible on these maps. And of course, they had to pick out the orientation for the streets and all of that kind of stuff, and they matched them to the orientation of downtown, more or less. But then you see as the city's grown, the blocks kind of change orientation to kind of match the river and things like that. Get more east-west as all of these, once you get outside of the military reservation, these things get platted off with north-south lines and things like that. So this program that I used is called QGIS, and it's a free software, and it's basically used to try and map things, and then trying to understand these maps. And one of the ways that you can use this program is to put in older maps. So you have to kind of have things to reference those older maps into. And so luckily, having that 1881 map, which lays out all the streets, it was really easy to kind of lay it over the modern street grid and kind of put it into this format. And then from that, I could lay in some of the earlier maps as well to try and figure out where buildings that weren't around in 1881 had been placed. So here it is, that 1881 map kind of oriented to north and then placed over the street grid. And I'll get some better pictures of that later on, but this kind of lets you know what the program does and how you kind of can use it. And then you can turn that map off once you have things laid in, and then you can see how things are. So one of the things I did when I laid that in is I could draw little yellow rectangles around all the buildings that had been shown on this map. So you can see this is the area around the parade ground with all of the guardhouse and the company quarters and the officers' quarters, the stables down by 10th Street, the old mill ponds. This is the woolen mill, which was just right outside of the military reservation. And then the bakery showed up on the map because it was still around in 1881. And then the carpenters and the wheelwright shop, all down in this area. So once I had those things as kind of a separate layer, I could turn the map off and then put them on the modern street grid. So you can see this is where the St. Vincent de Paul's is now, and that little shopping center across the street. The stables were down at the corner of 10th and Mount Hood. Here's these buildings just off of Jordan Street. There's where the Surgeon's Quarters is in Garrison Street here. So you can start getting an idea. It's a little hard to see, but there's a bunch of little yellow rectangles kind of all around in this area, which is kind of near the perimeter of the city. And it's a little hard to tell at this point whether they were like where people had started to settle, kind of move into this open ground that was the military reservation, but they hadn't really built really permanent dwellings because who knows, it's not really their land yet. So they look like they're mostly little tiny shacks. And so then you take away that background map and put on the satellite image, and then you get kind of the idea of where all these little places are. The Rourke House turned out to be a really good thing to key on to because it's still in its original location. And it was, I don't know if you all are familiar, the Wasco County Historical Society runs it as a museum. And it was built probably about 1850. So as one of the original fort buildings for a non-commissioned officer, but not part of the officially built part of the fort. And then
The Fort Cemetery is still there?
so the post cemetery here was removed in the Fort Vancouver, but when they removed cemeteries after abandoning them, they often didn't do such a good job. Usually they'd concentrate on marked graves or just move the graves of the soldiers, but there were other folks buried there as well, no doubt. And so I know I talked to Steve Lawrence a few years ago, and he said that when he was in high school, the city had been putting a new water service or sewer service down the street here and had excavated up a skeleton. And so he had kind of picked up all the pieces and donated it to the high school. So at least at that point, there was still somebody that had been buried in the post cemetery still there. I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't still interments up over there that hadn't gotten relocated. So then we can zoom in on some of the areas so it's a little easier to see. So here's the St. Vincent de Paul's and the restaurants and the grocery store over here. You can see there's a little cottage here, some over on this side, a couple over here. This is the mill pond that was used for the woolen mill. So there was a ditch running from Mill Creek that they used to fill up these ponds. And then they could draw water from the ponds to power the woolen mill. The stables are over here. Those are about the only fort buildings. The hospital is up here somewhere, but I haven't quite figured out whether one of these yellow squares is the remnant of the hospital or whether it was already gone by 1881. So this is that main area where the parade ground was right here. You can see Colonel Wright School is pretty much all at the western edge of the parade ground. The surgeon's quarters is here. So the parade ground kind of went all around here. I had thought that it would be pretty fascinating to try and find the old law officer's house because it's here in the playground back behind the school. But there's been a lot of ground moving in that area. They cut down this area a lot and filled over in here to kind of level out the playground. So I don't know if there's much left archaeologically at the log officer's quarters or not. This kind of depends on how deep the footprint was and how deep they dug to level things up. I know years ago, Pat May, who was also on the Landmarks Commission, told me that when her kids were going to school at Colonel Wright, they'd occasionally find artifacts out on the playgrounds. And here's the post cemetery again.
What did you say about the playground?
So, of course, I've gone to a lot of sources and had a lot of help on this. So this is just kind of shows just kind of a smattering of some of the folks that have helped with this. And this is another one of Dr. Brown's drawings. So this is showing the city or the town of the Dalles at that time. So I think this is in 1857. So this is right when it was platted out as an official town.
Nice.
Yeah. So I'd be happy to answer questions, and I also have some maps here that didn't turn out great, but you're kind of free to take one if you want.
Were there many Indians around Dalles City back then?
Yeah, there were some natives. I know I read Elizabeth Lord Laughlin's stuff, and she talks a lot about them, and they actually had a couple little different communities. There seemed to be a community both up near the Methodist mission before the Army came, and then another one over by the Catholic mission, and then one over closer to the mouth of Mill Creek.
Because the stable seems like it's so far away from where the people are.
Oh, yeah, it's down the slope. Yeah. It is generally a little separated from everything else. But once you start walking around, it's not that hard.
It's quite nice because we live like 2 blocks away.
Eric, which tribes were associated with the treaty? Oh, they're on the
They're mostly tribes that ended up at the Warm Springs Reservation. So I think the Wasco and stuff. I think they signed that. Yeah. I'd have to look. I'm not exactly sure about that. Maybe Julie could help her. No.
A question about how the townspeople interacted with the fort, and were they involved in building any of the fort buildings?
Yeah, so, when they were doing that whole upgrading of the fort from 1856 to 1859, they brought in a lot of civilian contractors. So they had, I think at some points, like 300 people on the payroll helping to build, but also helping to run freight. Because Fort Dalles was kind of the hub of all the other forts, inland forts. So Fort Walla Walla and Fort Simcoe and some of the other forts out there all got supplied out of Fort Dalles. So there was a large contingent of packers as well that used the area. And then a lot of times when folks retired, they'd just move into town and start up a store. So I know at least some of the stores downtown had been started by people that had kind of got out of their military commission and just started a store. So there's definitely interaction between, in some of the quartermasters' stores before they built these buildings, the 1856, 1858 building, the quartermasters had a storehouse in downtown as well, which they were paying rent on, and so they were kind of happy to get new quarters, or at least that's how they justified spending the money to build new quarters. Yeah.
Fort Simcoe, we spent a day going up there, so curious about it. And with those beautiful old buildings, how did that last so beautifully? Was it lasted a long time, or just didn't sit empty?
So I think pretty much after that one got abandoned by the military, it got turned over to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So, and then it was used in that capacity for a while, and then it was turned over to the tribe. So I think it never really got abandoned as such. So I think that helped.
And it wasn't in the middle of a growing town.
Yeah, and it wasn't in a place where land became such a premium.
The photograph that you showed of the bakery, was that the poet laureate sitting there, Joaquin?
Yeah, Joaquin Miller, is his name? Yeah, that
Eric,
was him.
could you restate the question so people can hear you?
Yeah, so the last question was about the photo of the bakery and whether that was Joaquin Miller. And it was Joaquin Miller, and that photograph was taken by Benjamin Gifford. Yes?
I may have missed this, but was Colonel Wright in charge of that fort?
Yeah, Colonel Wright was in charge of the fort. I don't know exactly the years he was in charge, but he was in charge during the remodeling, so that 1856 to 1858. And Captain Jordan was the quartermaster, and he was kind of put in charge, and his assistant was Louis Scholl, who actually drew up the plans for the buildings and the expansion. So, and all of those were based on a pattern book that was pretty popular at the time. Yes?
I live on the block, the sergeant's quarters, and one of the foundations of my building is really large and ornate blocks. Did they scavenge when they tore the buildings down? Did they scavenge those blocks for other things?
The answer is, when the buildings got removed, did people scavenge them? And yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that you read about in there, in the part of the act and the regulations, is that they realized that some of the improvements of the fort weren't on the platted blocks, that they were actually in streets. So they were going to sell those improvements separate from the land. And then, but I don't have any of those records, but you can see, especially some of those old photographs after the fort had been abandoned, it looks like people are already starting to scavenge things. And a lot of when the Army built these buildings, there was a pretty good slope there, and so they just built a big stout foundation under the buildings and onto the slope. Once streets got put through and everything, that area all got leveled up a little bit more. So almost all of the Army buildings had pretty substantial foundations, and I didn't point it out, but one of those Louis Scholl maps shows where the quarries were where they quarried the stones for the foundations and for the chimneys. And they're just at the base of the bluffs, kind of above where the fort was.
Where was the cemetery?
So the cemetery was, I think, kind of at the foot of, you know, where Liberty Street kind of goes right up the hill, right at where it kind of starts going up the bluff there. Yeah.
I was just wondering what happened to the mill pond.
The question is, what happened to the mill pond? I think it got filled in. There's houses on top of it now.
Where would
Somebody,
it have been?
so it's, I think on 8th Street. Let me go back and we'll look at it.
Yeah, we're right over here. It's on top of that. On the edge of it. Well, it's
So, right here is where the St. Vincent de Paul's is, so it's just about a block, and 1 and 2 blocks north of where the St. Vincent de Paul's is.
we're right up.
Yeah, right on the top of the bluff. Yeah.
Do you think that people could get copies, or could they purchase, maybe it's a fundraiser for us, those original paintings that we started with, a couple of those, could we make a postcard or something out of that?
Yeah, I think right now, I think that's what Fort Dalles Museum is working on doing that. And I think we have to work it out with the library at Yale. Any other questions? John?
Do you have an address for where the land office was?
John's asking whether I have an address for the land office, and I think I do somewhere, but I can't really remember.
I've never seen that picture before.
Yeah, one of the things, let me go back to that picture.
You're sure it was in the Dalles?
Yeah, so this picture came out of a photo album. So one day we were at Fort Dalles and some visitors brought in a photo album. And they allowed us to scan the photo album. And so this picture was in that photographic album. And if you go over just a little bit, it says, yeah, Crandall. And yeah, so it's in the same building that the Crandalls had their undertaking office, which is, I think, on 2nd Street, about where the, yeah.
Well, was Crandall's office in the Commodore building?
Pardon me?
I thought the Crandall building was in the Commodore building.
Yeah, but I think this predates the Commodore building.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's actually in the photo album, there's some interior photographs of I think because it was somebody that was associated with the Undertakers, this was his photo album. And so there's some interior pictures, and there's a picture of him sitting at a drafting table, drafting up the plans for probably one of the local buildings.
You had another photo that showed the area to the left of that building. So it shows the street beside it as well.
Yeah.
There we go.
I don't think it'd take too much work to figure out where this building was.
Sanborn maps will show you.
Yeah, the Sanborn maps are the old directories, so,
But that's residential.
yeah, but you know,
But there are a lot of shacks around too.
yeah, and this could be on 3rd Street, but I'm not positive.
So they were waiting in line to buy something?
You know, I don't know if they're waiting in line. to buy something or if it's a funeral. No, we might not be wearing white. Yeah.
I was just wondering, the bakery was on Bridge. Do you know what the cross street was for that?
Let's see. Well, actually, we can look at it on one of these maps up here. But I think it was, yeah, about 17th or so. Interestingly enough, the legend with the Rourke house is that the fireplace there is built out of the stones that came from the oven, the chimney at the bakery. Got kind of recycled into that building. And that building was built, or was purchased from the land office by Malcolm Moody, who then left it to the Lang sisters, who ran the land office, so. Yeah.
How did the surgeon's quarters keep from being torn down like the others? Some of them burned, but.
The question is how the surgeon's quarters stayed. And I think part of it is because there was a caretaker taking care of it. I know they had to do a lot of work to fix it up for a museum. There's a lot of correspondence about patching the plaster and redoing the woodwork. So I think there was a caretaker living there. I don't really know why, it managed to survive 20 years without getting bought by somebody. Maybe because it was assessed higher than anybody wanted to pay. Any other questions? Well, I thank you all for coming to this show and other ones.
Pencil. One pencil. One pencil to number 475383. 383. 383. Could be somebody up here. 383. 383. Hey, Helen, yes. And for another pencil. This is 475272. There. Gets a pencil. Okay, now we're kind of going up here. Membership. Drawing for a membership.
And you can always pass it on if you already have a membership. You can take it, put the name on who you want to have it.
And that number would be 475391. 391. Anybody have 391? Huh? 391, it's an upstairs, it's a red ticket. Going once, going twice. We'll draw again. Okay, this is a yellow ticket, 414449. Somebody downstairs, winner of a membership.
Hey, Carl, say the number again.
She's got a yellow tape.
414-449. 449? Oh. It's upstairs. Yep.
Oh, can we do it again?
Okay, now the grand prize. A bottle of wine. Oh, it's another yellow ticket. 280060. Somebody's celebrating downstairs. Well, maybe they'll share wine for the refreshment time. Please enjoy some refreshments. We have all kinds of cookies, and you don't want to take them home, so enjoy some refreshments. And if you haven't given us your email, let us know, and we'll let you know when other things happen here at the old courthouse. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Eric.
They hit kind of hard, don't they?
Oh my God. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Oh, that was smart. I can't believe as cold as it is, how hot.
Isn't that right? Yeah, I was surprised.
Feel that way.
It's been good because the heating system really